Hello and welcome back to our series on beginning Google Apps Script for HR, brought to you by Prairie HR Solutions. My name is Jake Finger, Principal Consultant, and in this video, I would like to begin taking everything we've learned and starting to do something with it. So up to this point, we have created a reference sheet, I guess you could say, of various code snippets that we will encounter regularly when we're trying to provide solutions in Google Apps Script. We've talked about if and switch statements, those conditional statements. We've talked about the map method, filter method, talked about arrays, how to get data from a sheet, how to write data to a sheet. And now I want to take all that together and actually do something with it. And once we start doing something with it, we'll get more and more code snippets created. But for now, we have that base so we can jump into the fun stuff of actually creating solutions. And the first solution I want to create is we're going to work in this spreadsheet. We're not going to get too fancy and go into a sidebar yet or a web app, new web page. We're going to stay within this sheet. And we've talked about ways that we can run functions like grab data and manipulate it or certain things. We can do it either with simple triggers or installable triggers. Those simple triggers are like on open, on edit. But there's another way that we can create a trigger, and we can create a customized menu item up here. Because if we think about, say, we want to run that function that grabbed all of our data and then put it into array and then mapped it by our employee emails. Well, we don't have a menu option for that. So what we need to do is create it. And how these menu options work is these captions up here are the menu items themselves. And then when you hover over them, you have these sub items. And when we go in and click a sub item, it runs its own specific function. And what we're needing to create or customize is we need a special menu item that does our functions, does what it wants to do. So that's what we're going to focus on today is creating that. And then from that, we are going to build on other things. We'll build on, some validations, maybe some drop downs, and other things. But first, we need that menu button. So let's go over here and back to our script file. You'll notice that I took our if and switch statements and put them over here in our reference file, just so we have a clean sheet. And in what we want that menu item to do is appear every single time that spreadsheet is open. And if you watch the previous videos, you'll remember that we have a function that is built into Google Apps Script that does just that. We simply have to call it on open. So let's create a function called on open. And what that's going to do is say this function is triggered every time something is open. In our case, it's going to be this sheet. Now this works and we're able to create a menu item because this script is bound to that sheet. So what we initially want to do is we want to call or we want to identify in Google Apps Script that we are working with a spreadsheet app. Now we're not able to actually use this variable because this variable drills down all the way to get sheet by name. And we don't want it to pop up every time, a user's only on this sheet here. We want it to pop up every time. We want it to be always present. So that's why we're just using the spreadsheet app. We're declaring a new one. And then in this spreadsheet app, what we want to do is we want to get the user interface. So the user interface is just how a user interacts with that document or that product. And since it's web-based, everything about that document or that sheet in our case is the user interface. Each cell, each row, each column, the menu item. So that is the interface and we have to get it. We have to tell Google that that is what we want to focus on. Now we could just in this in a and create it as a variable. So let's do that. Let's say UI is equal to this, essentially equal to the UI. And then we can take that UI variable and we can create a menu. And we don't want an add-on menu because an add-on menu is something completely different, but we want to create a menu. And you can see that there's other things we can do here, which we'll get into in the future. But let's just simply create a menu, and that is a method, so we need the parentheses. And when we type in the parentheses, you'll see it gives us a requirement that the create menu needs. And it needs a caption in the form of a string. So let's call this simply HR interface. And then with that HR interface, we need to give it those sub items. So we can continue on our instructions by hitting period. And we want to add, now, this submenu is a little bit different. This separator is a little bit different, but right now what we're looking for, just to keep it simple, is we just want to add an item underneath this this HR interface. So let's just do add item. We'll get into the other ones later on, I'm sure. And this add item, being a method, needs the parentheses, and those parentheses are going to require another caption, which is what this item is going to be called. And then it's going to need a function. So when we click on that, what is it that we want it to do? What function is it that we want it to run? That function name has to be in the form of a string, so it's going to need the quotation marks. So let's just call this, instructions for now. And the function that we want to do is, let's just say show instructions. Now remember, this is, and I do this all the time because I'm just so used to writing functions without the quotation marks. But you'll remember that this add item method requires it to be in quotation marks. And now what we want to do is, if we were just to leave it there here, it would create that menu item. It would create all of this. The problem is we need to tell it to add it to this UI. So how we can do that is just continuing on the instructions and pressing add to UI down here. And that's a method, so it's going to require the parentheses. And now we can end it. So now what should happen is, or what we're wanting to have happen is, when that sheet is open, it's going to run this function automatically. It's going to get the UI, and then it's going to create a menu called HR interface. And then it's going, under that HR interface, it's going to create an item called instructions. And then when we push that instructions, it's going to run this function here. So let's go back to our sheet and see if that works. So we'll share this. You'll notice that we don't have any custom menu item up here, but let's refresh. And when we refresh, you'll notice that once it gets done loading, it's automatically running that function. And here we have our custom menu item. So now if we were to open this up, we should see instructions. Now we can mash this instructions anytime we, however long we want. We can just go crazy on mashing it. Nothing's going to happen because that function that we're trying to refer to simply doesn't exist. And when we try to run it, it'll try to run it, but then it'll say, well, function is not found. Then you can click details and it'll give you a different detail. But what I would like to do is create a function, this show instructions, that looks like this. Because the instructions, anytime somebody comes up and uses our enhanced spreadsheet here, we want them to to kind of know what it does. So let's create this, this little modal here, or just a simple alert for right now, because a modal is going to require HTML. So let's just create an alert. So we'll close all this out, dismiss this, and let's go back to our code. And let's create this shows instructions function right here. So let's go in here, create a function, and we'll call it show instructions. And what we're wanting it to do is create that pop-up box that we've seen. And it just needs to be a simple pop-up box. We don't need to ask anybody like a prompt. They don't need to do anything else with it. We're just informing them of something. So what we can do is we need to get the UI, because we want that alert in this case to populate on the UI. So we would need to create another variable. Now remember, we talked about variables, and this variable, the scope of this variable is within this function, which means it can only be accessed by this function. What we can do is, instead of creating it again, because we're going to need to declare the spreadsheet app and get the UI, we can just simply grab this and bring it up here. And then that way, any function that needs the UI can grab it. Since we're never ever going to change this, let's make this, instead of let's make this a constant. And then the same thing with this this sheet here. We'll create another one and just say records. I prefer to call the variables, if I'm assigning it to a sheet by name, I prefer to just call it whatever it is, but that will change all the places that this is referenced. So we'll do that later. And now we can simply just call the UI. And in that UI, we simply want to do an alert. Now, an alert method is that pop-up box that we've seen. And you'll see it here in a second when we run it. And it's a method, so it requires the parentheses. And in the parentheses, it is wanting the prompt in the form of a string. So let's do, you'll notice that anytime you start learning any kind of code, this is just the default to produce. The first thing you'll ever produce is hello world. But we're going to be different. Let's actually say, simply this: welcome to the HR interface, just so it produces something. So now what happens is, when we come back over to our sheet, or go back over to our sheet, refresh it, it's going to run this code. It's going to populate all of our items. And then this time when we hit instructions, it should automatically fire this function that produces this alert. Since we created new code and saved it, anytime that we do that, we must refresh. Our previous menu item didn't go away, but it hasn't picked up on that new function yet. It hasn't picked up on what we saved. So let's refresh it so it runs that code and grabs it. And then you'll see here's HR interface. And now when we click on instructions, it'll run the script, and here we go. It'll pop up that interface. So here we can actually write our instructions, which we will. But that is a way that we can create a customizable menu item. So let's actually put another item in our HR interface. So right now we have instructions. Let's put another item in here, and we'll call that create dropdown, because that way we can knock out another piece of Google Apps Script that allows you to work with the sheet, and that is creating a dropdown box. So let's go back over here to our code. And you'll see that on open, we are running this. Well, let's put this in a variable. Let's make that variable, let's call it menu item for now. And let's make that equal to that. And then what we can do is we can end this here and then put this menu item. And what I did is I simply just broke up this this line of code here, and then I referred back to that menu item to continue on the code. And then let's store this actually in a variable, and let's call this instructions. And then let's create a new item there, but I'm thinking about, let's create a separation first. So we'd like a nice little line there. Well, we can do that later. Let's just see how it looks first. Let's create it doesn't need to be in it should be in a variable. Yep. So let's create this as drop down. This is the variable name. And that is going to equal menu item dot add item. And this one is going to be create drop down. And the function we're going to want to run is create drop down. And then what we're going to want to do is add that to UI. Now, since we're adding it to the UI, I guess we don't need these in variables because it's going to do it anyway. So let's save this. And then let's go back to our sheet here. We'll run our code. We'll see our HR interface, and then you'll see that we have two, and we can run our HR interface. It'll run that code, and we have nothing. This create DD isn't there. We haven't created it yet, but we have now an additional item. I'm wondering if we should add just a little line there, separator. So let's go back and do that. And where we want that line is after it creates this instruction. So we can simply just go down and then reference that menu item again. And this time we want to add a separator. Okay, let's save it and then go back and refresh. So you see that separator isn't there until we refresh it. And there we go. Yep, I like that. That'll work because that'll give us a chance to take the instructions and kind of make it visibly different than the rest of our pieces. So what I would like to do is take this cell right here, this A19, and make it a drop-down box. And we want to make it a drop-down box, not just automatically. We want to, just for the sake of instructions, do that when we push this button. So let's go over and create that. Come back over here to our code. And we want this box to be created, this drop-down box to be created every time that we push this create drop-down. So that is this function right here. So we need to create that function. So let's write this function here real quick, and it is create DD. And this function, we are going to need to go to this sheet, and let's make this a constant as well, because that'll never change. So what we can do is call our sheet, and we want to get the range of that sheet, and we want row 19, column 1. And let's put this in a variable. Let's just call this, for the sake of instructions, let's just call it cell. Let's call it DD cell. And then in that DD cell, what we want to do is we want to create a rule. We need a rule for that drop-down box. So let's create that variable. It'll be easier to show instead of talk through it. And this rule comes in the form of a data validation. So we need to create a new data validation, and we need to create that in our spreadsheet app. So we have to write spreadsheet app, and then when we press dot to continue that on, what we need to do is set a new data validation, which is right there. It's a method, so we need to include the parentheses. Nothing's going to be in here quite yet. Continuing on with this instructions, we need that validation to be required. And what we want to require are certain values. And we're just going to do simply yes, no, I have no clue, things like that. And we can do a value in a range, which means we can go to another sheet or another range of cells to pull that list. But for now, let's just do require value in list. Now we need to create that list, and that list can come to us either in a variable or we can create it here. For the sake of the instructions, I want to just create it here, and it needs to be as you can see, it's a string. It's in the form of a string, but also an array. So we need to ensure that it is an array. So let's just simply do yes, no, unknown, and then what we'll do is that, just to make sure that it is open and an option there. Now that we have the validation stating that it's requiring a value in a list, and here's our list, what we need to do now is we need to build this validation into our code. So anytime that you set a new validation, when you're doing it on a Google Sheet, you have to build that validation. It always must end with build. So now we have our rule and we have our target cell. So now what we need to do is we need to set this rule in that cell. So to do that, we just reference this cell, dot, and we want to set a data validation. You'll see it's right here. And that is a method. So we need our parentheses, and inside our parentheses, we need to put that validation. And that validation exists in our DD rule. So let's save this. And we'll go back to our spreadsheet. Since we wrote new code, we need to refresh it and make sure it picks that code up. So let's refresh. So now when we click on this, we can click on instructions. Instructions works fine. There it is. And then we can go to create dropdown. Now remember what we did is what we're wanting is to create a dropdown here with yes, no, unknown, and the dash as options. So let's go ahead and try that. It's running the script. It finished the script, and as you can see, it created a drop-down box with our options here. So when we're thinking of drop-down boxes, you're like, wow, that's okay, woohoo. We created a drop-down box. What use is that possibly going to do? Well, if we refresh it, let's refresh it, you'll notice that it actually goes away. So say what we want to do is actually create, say, a dashboard. So what we can do is come over here, create a new, oops, not rename. We create a new sheet, and let's call this sheet dashboard. And in this dashboard, which we can do the next video, we want to populate, refresh this so that that drop down goes away. Well, this drop down, we are setting the validation. So it will always be here until we remove the rule. Now we can remove the rule every time that we close this or opens it. Once it opens, it just removes that validation. But say we want to populate a drop down box on a dashboard to where you select what it is that you want to do. I want to search an employee. I want to update an employee record. I want to do something like that or this or run an analysis. And then based on that selection, you want to be able to populate the options of another drop down. That's called a cascading drop down. So we select one value, and then depending on that value, it updates the contents of the second drop down to match that value. So I'm going to end our video here because the next video, I want us to take that drop down and produce it. One, I want to clear it so we can show how to clear. And then I want to instead of populating that drop down here, I want to go over to a dashboard and populate it here. And next video, we will talk all about those drop downs and the validations, because drop downs are a great way to have the user interact in a controlled way. They're just not typing anything that they want. They're being forced to select what it is that you're giving them. And then based on those selections, we can continue on down and drill down to fine tune what it is that we are trying to get them to do. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did and you find these series helpful, please hit that subscribe button and we'll continue to bring you these episodes and series. If you have an idea or would like to know more information about something or how to do something, please use that email down there at the bottom. We have our Gmail account there. Please send us an email and we'll be happy to see if we can put something together for you. We can talk offline or whatnot. But I hope we're able to see you on the next video. And until then, please take care.